Joining. My name is Jessie Leonard. I am the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives in AI and Data for Visa. We are super excited to have you all here today. This time last year, we were here sponsoring a panel on diversity and inclusion in the digital world. And I'm really pleased to be evolving and continuing that conversation today as we talk about the issue of AI ethics and bias. This is something which I think we have all this year witnessed, particularly when it comes to COVID, but also with huge social movements like Black Lives Matter. And I think it's been very, very much in everyone's minds this year, the best and the worst that technology can provide us as a society. And the potential for bias is absolutely at the forefront of everyone's minds in the community as we consider what the potential risks might be. We have a fantastic panel with us here today. I'm so proud. We don't normally do panels this size. Can anyone who's not part of the panel go on mute? Thank you. I was just saying, we don't normally do panels this size, but when they all absolutely had to have them all. So today with us, we have Ashley Ainsley, who is the co-founder of Color and Tech. We have Brahmi Balaram, who's head of AI research and ethics at NHS AI Lab. We've got Renee Cummings, who is data activist in residence, the School of Data Science, University of Virginia, and community scholar, Columbia University. I love data activist in residence. That's a super cool title. We have Dr. Kanta Dihal, who is a senior research fellow and principal investigator of global AI narratives at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at Cambridge. Again, principal investigator of global and AI narratives. These are just like superhero titles. I love this. And we've got Alan Shaw, who's the president and CTO of Recycle Track Systems and a founding partner of Deed Partners. So we're going to, because of the size of the panel, keep the questions few, but I hope that's going to give everybody a great chance to really, really elaborate on all of their answers. So if I can come, first of all, I'd love to start with you, Renee. And this is a really tricky question, so I apologize for giving you a tough one at the start. But when we talk about issues of bias and fairness, really, it's almost impossible, isn't it, to define what we mean by fairness, to really get down to one definition of that, because we're thinking sociologically, mathematically, we're thinking about technology definitions of fairness. In your world, how would you define these things?
Well, thank you so much, Jessica. Are you hearing me?
We hear you, perfect.
Fantastic. So it's really the big challenge right now when it comes to looking at the question of algorithmic justice. So what is the mathematical formula for fairness or for creditworthiness or for honesty? So we know that's a major challenge. And for me, at the intersection of criminal justice and AI, where I do much of my work, we have seen those challenges in the criminal justice system, those risk assessment tools that were designed to predict recidivism or reoffending, and how those tools have turned out to be either opaque at best or pretty much over-predicting risks when it comes to Black and brown men in particular. So we've seen that challenge of fairness in criminal justice. We've seen it in finance, in credit, in education, in housing, in healthcare. And why is there a challenge? Because that question of fairness goes back historically into the contest of conquest and colonization and oppression and systemic racism and implicit bias. So how do you pull implicit bias out of the mathematical calculation and operate in something that is just and equitable, inclusive, and diverse? So it's one of the greatest challenges we have right now when it comes to designing algorithmic decision-making systems.
Kanta, can I come to you next, please? So could you explain a little bit? I mean, I think that what Renee's talked about is a huge thorny issue from a sociological perspective, right? The extent to which, you can talk about the mathematical representations of bias, but actually this is, as we have in the title of the event, systemic. What do you see from a narratives perspective when it comes to this issue of fairness in technology?
Right. Well, I agree that it's indeed a sociological problem that goes much deeper than the development of these technologies in recent decades, because these technologies themselves are based on ideas of what people want from technology that have been shaped by literally centuries of narratives about intelligent machines and how they should function in our lives, what they should be able to do, and what we should be able to want from technology. Now, unfortunately, the we represented in those narratives is an extremely narrow group of people, and those are the vast majority of the technology, which leads to these stories influencing the technology, but also the technology then influencing and exacerbating these biases in society, which in turn leads to perceptions of AI and other digital technologies as being for and in the service of a narrow group of people. And that in its turn leads to a narrowing of the field potentially, if we don't step in and do the kind of work that everyone here on the panel is doing in order to break that cycle of injustice.
And Ashley, can I come to you and ask you the same question? So defining fairness. You've worked in big tech, and you've now founded your own organization. What kind of definition of fairness sits in your mind when we think about systemic discrimination?
Yeah, it's a massive question, and I mean, to be honest, fairness isn't necessarily the word I use. I think when I think about some of these things, I think almost, what's common in the world that I live in a lot of the time now is this kind of concept of equity, and making sure that things and opportunity is equitable for people. And both when we think about kind of like AI and discrimination, if we think about AI, but we think about, well, who are the people who are making these decisions? What are the data inputs, and who are the people who are responsible for these algorithms, so to speak? And what opportunities do they have to have equitable input into those systems, whether that be challenging the decisions that are made, challenges and the predispositions of the people who are making them, where the data sets are coming from, how those data sets are evaluated, the different weighting of the values of different things in those data sets, depending on what communities people are coming from, and assessing those and the relative importance of those, and ultimately making sure that there is an opportunity for people to have, I suppose, equal access and share of voice and opportunity to influence at the beginning point of the process, if that makes sense. So I'm not even talking about the outputs and what happens after the thing.
Yeah, you're talking about the process.
Yeah, like the process and the people who fundamentally make the process. And is that equitable? Is the opportunity for those people to get to that point fair? I.e., does everybody have that? When they are at that point, is it fair that they have the opportunity to speak, and is their opinion included and involved ultimately? And then what does that mean for the outputs that we have? And when we are reflected and evaluating on them, how do we build into our understanding of a better system of evaluation of the outcomes of what we do? And I don't think there is probably enough critical kind of conversation at probably all levels of those, and that's kind of where we are starting to see some movement, but it's one of the things I think about. So it's not necessarily fairness, it's equitable is more the language that I come across in my everyday life.
I think that's fascinating, and I think also because quite often in the data science community, obviously, we have a very high level of awareness that you can get to, let's say 10, 20, 30 plus definitions of fairness if you want to in modeling, but they don't necessarily get you to equity. I think that's a really fascinating distinction that you make there. And the point, I love us to come back to the point you just made around the sort of input and the outcomes as well, because I think that's going to come up a lot in the discussion. Could I ask Bromi to come in at this point? So again, we're talking, definitions of fairness, and I love that Ashley's added equity in here. You work in the public sector. What's government's view of this?
Thanks, Jessica. So I guess there are two ways for me to answer this question. I think one way of answering it is like fairness for whom. So who are we specifically talking about when we're thinking of who's being discriminated against? Can we get like much more specific about how we're defining these problems of bias and discrimination that we're responding to? So for example, in the healthcare context, the impact using these algorithms, mainly in the US so far, has been racialized. So the use of algorithms in the US has been disproportionately harming ethnic minorities and deepening existing racial and ethnic inequalities in health outcomes. And I guess the other way to sort of think about it is I would say it's not just about the tools themselves, but also just the culture around what's happening in terms of the way that these tools have been implemented and the way that we've been able to challenge that. I think that we need to start talking a lot more about culture, and I think that what's happened this past week in terms of the treatment of some ethicists in this space, like that's something that we need to keep when we're thinking actions of fairness and who is able to challenge what's happening in the AI and ethics space, and how they're treated as well by those who have power.
I'm pretty sure I know the example you're talking about, and I think it's going to come up later. We are going to get to a point around culture and governance, and I'd love us to get to a discussion around how we can encourage companies to have these conversations and to listen to their ethicists when they've appointed an ethics board or a head of ethics, like the lady that I think you're talking about. How do we make sure that companies follow through on that? And finally, Alan, can I come to you for, you work in, you have worked rather, I should say, in the same sector as me, which is in finance. Were there specific definitions of fairness there? And also, I know that, now your work is around sustainability. Again, a whole different definition, and certainly a definition of equity that must come into play there.
Yeah, I'm loving listening to everyone speak, because although I'm a panelist,
I'm so sorry, Alan. There may be one person on the call who's not on mute in the audience. If you could just mute that, super. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'll keep going. So no worries at all. My point was, I'm really enjoying the conversation. It's making me think even more deeply about fairness. And I think of fairness similarly to everyone on the panel. I'm going to take a slight shift to it, right? And really put a sustainability lens on it. So just a couple of data points just to talk about fairness. Is it fair for the world's richest 10% to be responsible for 50% of carbon emissions? And if you think about it, the poor disproportionately like to using public transportation, they avoid long haul flights. And so what you're finding is that the worst consequences of environmental degradation is actually visited on the homes, workplaces, families, and bodies of the poor. And so is that fair, right? And probably the answer is no. Another good point to kind of think through, Ashley, I believe, spoke a little bit to this, but when you think about data sets and you think about fairness in AI, the problem often is because historical data sets are inherently biased, right? And when you even think about data sets as it relates to underprivileged communities, the folks that created the data sets to begin with are probably not underprivileged. And so therefore that data set is not representative of the underprivileged communities. And then you can go a step further and, again, talking about fairness, there's an assumption that underprivileged or underrepresented communities have access to this technology. So the very technology that's capturing the information, not only is it not representative of the communities it's trying to serve, but those communities then in and of themselves don't have access to the technology. And so you've got a cascading effect of inequality, inequity, and discrimination that can be accelerated with the use of AI.
Yeah. So we're getting into it now, aren't we? We're talking about specifically about some of the particular communities here that suffer the most from this exclusion or other disproportionate impact. On that, I want to come back to Renee for the second question, which is around the biggest challenges and issues that you've seen arising in the last year or so in your field in particular. And I want to ask each of the panelists this in turn. Not only what have you seen appearing, but why do you think it happened? What do you think the causes were of what's happened?
Thanks. So I think for me, I work in two areas. I work in academia as well as in the private sector. So in the private sector, it's been the issue of crises. And me coming in as someone who specializes in diversity, equity, and inclusion within the tech space is really about helping organizations build a more ethical culture. For many of them, it could just be ethics or window dressing with ethics. Some of them it's because they are in a place of crisis. I do a lot of work when it comes to risk management and bringing that level of intellectual confrontation into the C-suite so we can look at the kinds of risks that could happen across the life cycles of any sort of new and emerging technology that's about to be deployed, from design into development into deployment. In the space of academia, the fact that I'm in this residency, it's because we have seen the challenges with data. So much of what I do is considered data disruption. So I really recreate those narratives that have been historically misleading. And the three areas I focus on would be due diligence when it comes to the application of data into any kind of system, duty of care, which is most critical to the ways in which we use data, and due process, which is even more critical within the criminal justice space, which is where we saw the first sets of challenges with algorithmic decision-making systems. So I look at things like policing, big data policing, surveillance, facial recognition, and how we are creating this digital force that's being used with algorithms. So in the realm of law enforcement is where we see so many of these new challenges. So for me, it would be new concepts like digital arrests, geofencing warrants, geolocation warrants, subpoenas. This is the area that I'm in, and much of the public is not aware of that. So much of the work that I do as a data activist would be community and stakeholder engagement and bringing people into the conversation and letting them understand the power of their data and that they are not consumers, that they are producers. So really bringing that conversation to disenfranchised and disinvested communities.
I can hear a bit of the Shoshana Zuboff school of thought difference between I mean, it's very interesting to have you on the panel, obviously, because we do have examples of the use of these technologies in criminal justice and policing in this country. I suspect not on the same scale or to the same degree of advancement as you have in the US. So I think it's very interesting for all of us to hear from you about that. Someone said to me a while ago, actually, someone said to me, I was watching a great panel with Shoshana Zuboff and Margarita Vestager, our EU Digital Commissioner, and they were having a conversation around the fact that we were scaling the use of these technologies even as they were failing us. Do you think that that's the case when it comes to the issue of bias and discrimination in your field, Renee?
Definitely. I think what happened is that everyone was interested in getting things that would be efficient and expedient when it came to criminal justice, and no one was looking at those data sets, particularly the criminal justice system, that have just been embroiled and plagued with bias. When you look at the history of policing, you've got to, particularly in the United States, attach that to the history of enslaved people. And the fact that the whole concept of policing enslavement, runaway slaves, and how you bring those people back, enforcing those slave codes were so much involved in policing. So when I say it always comes back to particularly power and privilege when it comes to this technology. And how does power and privilege come into the design, the denotation, the definitions, the distinctions that we use with data, and understanding behind every data point, there could be a history of tragedy and trauma. So it really is bringing a broader perspective in the ways in which we understand data and how we plan to use data.
And a very personal one, from the way you've just phrased that. Thank you so much. Burmi, can I come to you? So, I mean, the question of what have your biggest challenges been in the year, given where you work, I think, we all know the amazing work that you've been doing over there. Would you tell us a little bit about how that's been reflected in the context of this discussion?
Sure. So the NHS AI Lab is specifically tasked with accelerating the safe, ethical, and effective adoption of AI in the health and care system in the UK. And I think one of the things to make clear is that we're just trying to get the basics right now. Like, this technology isn't as advanced as we imagine it would be in the healthcare system here. And with the AI award, which is a 140 million pound award that we're giving to various technologies to start testing and implementing some of their AI solutions, we are using that as a basis for trying to get things like validation and the evaluation of these technologies right. And I would say that specifically when it comes to how we address bias, that this is still very much a work in progress. We still kind of need like a clear steer from the regulators in terms of how they're sort of looking at these questions. And I guess one of the things to keep in mind is that there have been a number of fairness tools, for example, that have been produced by companies like like IBM to address questions of bias in data sets and help mitigate some of these harms. But we're just not really clear on the effectiveness or the rates of take-up of these tools. And I think that's something that we're still trying to work out. We need to, one, consider what sort of tools we have on hand, and then two, begin to evaluate where they're useful in addressing this problem. And then I guess the third thing, we actually integrate them into this pipeline that we're developing for adopting AI in healthcare.
And can I just pick up on healthcare for a moment as well as a sector, because typically with healthcare, you're dealing at the most sensitive end of the spectrum when it comes to data and potentially life-changing decisions made by automated decisioning systems. What extra safeguards do you think need to apply in those sort of sensitive situations in order to avoid the discrimination and risk of bias?
So we're starting to experiment with some practical tools. So for example, the use of algorithmic impact assessments has been something that's been talked about for quite some time, I would say at least for a couple of years now, and there have been a couple models that have been developed, but we don't actually have that many examples of them being used. I think the most known one is their use by the Canadian government when it comes to how public agencies roll out these sorts of tools. But what does it actually mean in practice for healthcare? How can we actually leverage our power as an organization to ensure that some of the technology companies that we're working with are actually able to implement these assessments? And so it might be that we develop something that's quite reciprocal in nature. So if you have access to, say, our national medical imaging database, then you are therefore, you have to be able to complete one of these assessments. And as part of that assessment, you are then considering things like the ethical and social implications of your product and how they might disproportionately affect different communities.
Difficult to do as a tick box system, isn't it? But some kind of auditability and you know, traceability of those discussions, I completely agree with you, is very important. And we think a huge amount about this as a company internally at Visa. Ashley, can I come to you? Biggest challenges of the year, and you know, my goodness, what a year it's been.
Honestly, I mean, where do I begin?
I mean, got a list this long of like, how long have I got?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think maybe the way to frame this and to think about it is what are the enduring challenges for next year, if that makes sense. I think this year's there's been a lot of kind of stuff that's happened. And I think, you know, we've all lived through it. You know, me personally, I've felt it. It's been my life, it's been my work, it's been my passion, it's been my pursuit. And I think certainly for next year, I think there are some broader conversations. I think from a corporate point of view, we and the public now have far more of a consciousness and awareness of some of the things that really ultimately impact. You know, so if we talk about AI, you know, we've had examples around kind of policing. You know, we're seeing technology really shift things. I mean, you know, we saw reports earlier this year that virtual backgrounds didn't work because of people's colour of their skins. I mean, in every single walk of life, we've seen some of these issues turn up. So really, it's thinking about like how are they building in sustainable plans and processes to have robust ways of dealing with some of these things as we increase our reliance on some of these technologies, and the prevalence of these technologies creeps into more people's everyday lives. You know, historically, maybe, you know, parts of AI and machine learning have been kind of experimental or niche or have sat kind of outside of a core product, so to speak. That is now not the case, and that this is mass applied. Take the analogy of the vaccine, everyone's got to have it. So, you know, if you think everybody's using all of these things, we need to make sure that we have the processes in place that scale with billions of users, and actually how are technology companies really addressing that to make sure that there is a feedback loops that happen, that they can react, that they are thinking about stuff before they have to react. And some of the big companies have kind of been getting there, but, you know, as we've seen across, you know, the last few weeks, you know, there are still challenges in that. And for those companies which are now actively adopting these technologies, more so because of the acceleration of COVID, how on earth are they going to build in these processes and get the right talent in place and all of these things? And for me, that's like a massive enduring challenge, which, you know, will be more keenly felt actually as we think about some of the consequences of things that are going on. Because the longer that people start to rely on technology and the less equitable that technology is, the speed of which there is an inequitable fallout from that becomes more exponential ultimately. Lots
Yeah.
of big words in there. I had to really think
No,
about
but
those
I
ones,
think
didn't I? But you get what I mean.
you make
So,
a very, very good point that, yeah, I mean, you know, the great thing about automated decision making is you can scale decisions. The worst thing about automated decision making is you're scaling decisions. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And, you know, for me, I'm not convinced that I've seen enough of that thinking. Certainly haven't seen enough of the dialogue. And I think some of that dialogue should be public, because I think that it shouldn't necessarily be in the realms of effectively what is usually quite a homogenous room of people to decide
Yeah.
how we go about building these things. So I think there needs to be far more public consultation and discussion about these things, both from an educational point of view, but also about including more people into these discussions in general, whether they are PhDs, research scientists, or your everyday person crossing the road. And, you know, I think that is super important. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we'll see next year.
I want to come back to you about that, because I agree with you and I don't have the answer. And somewhere on this panel, we're going to get to it. Okay, can I come to you, Alan, then? You know, the challenges in the sustainability services sector this year. I mean, some people have said that actually one of the things that's come out of COVID, which can give us a bit of hope, is that there's been a renewed focus on sustainability and climate change as an issue around the world, in the sense that when we build back better, we may be looking at the ways that we can use technology to further that sustainability agenda. Do you think that's true? And if so, what challenges have you seen in the last year with ensuring that there's fairness and equity in the way that technology gets applied in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to answer the question. I'm going to answer both questions. Kind of what we're doing at Recycle Track Systems that I think is helping the problem. But then I want to link back to the previous question, because I think it's fascinating to talk about the food systems and food stamps and discrimination, and how data and inherent bias in the data can actually yield the wrong outcome. So at Recycle Track Systems, we're all about zero waste, right? So we literally help universities, individuals, corporations live a zero waste lifestyle by reducing their impact on climate change by diverting materials from landfills. And so part of our business is really taking food waste. Like in the United States, 40% of food is wasted, right? We talk about homelessness, and we talk about poverty and starvation. 40% of food just goes into the trash can. And so what we do is we take food, we extract the water from the food. Water conservation is a big topic for the global community. And then we take the dry material, we create fertilizer because it's nutrient rich, it's got fats, it's got minerals. And then of course we take that water and create a cleaning supply out of it. So we've taken food waste that normally would have gone into a landfill and create methane gas, and we've done something with it. We've created zero waste. But in doing that research and running that part of the business, one of the things that we started to really think about was food and the discrimination in the food system. So quick data point for everyone, in the United States, there are approximately like 36 million people that currently receive what is called Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is SNAP. It's basically food stamps. It's assistance for privileged communities. And according to the demographic data, about 39% of these participants are white, 25% African American, 10% Hispanic, so on and so forth. And so the discrimination I'm going to talk about is not necessarily ethnic, but it's about underrepresented, underprivileged communities. Interesting enough, the SNAP program subsidizes retailers for selling the same food, but high in sugars, saturated fats, sodium, and literally the USDA, which is a government agency which talks to Americans about how to eat healthy, actually tell Americans to avoid those very materials, avoid those foods. And so what we're seeing here is we're seeing a government program geared towards helping, actually attributing to obesity, attributing to health issues because of the way it's subsidizing a particular community. And then if you take it a step further, if you think about the data set that's being created by this program regarding these communities that are consuming or benefiting, quote unquote, from it, it actually creates more bias, right? So you've got an underprivileged, underrepresented community that actually has the opportunity to eat healthy, and actually because of the system, they're told not to, they're forced not to. So that's an example of how you can do it the right way, right, in terms of zero waste sustainability and really doing something with food, but also how these systems, these data platforms can actually yield the wrong outcome.
Thank you. And finally, Cantor, what have you seen in the last year in terms of challenges? And I'm going to add on Ashley's piece, which is what do you think the challenges are going to be next year? Because I like that.
Yeah, no, very good question. So this year, in my field in particular, we've seen that naive techno-optimism has really become inexcusable. With so many revelations and protests, walkouts, so many ways of showing the biases and inequalities in all kinds of technologies. Finally, these historical perspectives, these sociological perspectives are being acknowledged, and it has become undeniable that they matter. So for next year, I hope that that kind of work can start influencing people developing technology before it goes out into the world. That it can, that people can start taking it into account from the idea stage onwards. That an ethicist in a company doesn't need to ethics wash, as I've heard it called, but that this becomes a natural part of the development stage before it starts affecting so many people's lives.
I think it's a very good point, and we saw an example here over the summer with an education algorithm which was used for a time to make decisions around secondary education, further education for British students, which some statistics I saw rated the accuracy of parts of the model at around 36%. And it did make you sit there and think, I don't know of a car manufacturer in the world that could get a car off of their factory floor where the brakes were 36% likely to work. And yet we have algorithms with the potential for huge discrimination inherent in them being released with that sort of level of accuracy. So I'm very, very much with you. Inexcusable techno-optimism I've written down on my notebook here, and I shall start to use. Can we get into a little bit here, because I know a lot of people in the audience are interested in this, some of the tools and techniques that can be used to fix this. And I do want to talk a little bit technical here, because my final question is going to be around culture and governance, and so I do want to get to all that. But I also just want to understand a little bit about what sorts of tools and techniques are emerging. We have a debate about, can you use AI to fight AI bias? What else is happening out there at the cutting edge? Or indeed, what should we just be using more of in order to help us with this? Some things could be very, very simple, some things more complicated. Brumi, I'd love to start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So I guess, first of all,
I talked about algorithmic impact assessment, so I won't make you do that one again, but of course that's a very interesting one. Yeah.
Sure. I guess I just wanted to say that I think it's really great that we're having a discussion that's specifically about tools and techniques, because it feels like the conversation has moved on from simply talking about principles and values and frameworks to something that's more concrete and tangible and could lead to practical implementation. So I've already mentioned that we're excited about impact assessments. I think that in general, like in terms of the pipeline, we're also looking at how do we actually validate the technology. So how do we make sure that it's working as it should or does what it says on the tin? How are we actually going to have standards in order to evaluate this technology in test sites? And then I think specifically on these like questions of discrimination and bias in healthcare, we're going to be running a research call next year that specifically looks at this question of how we can leverage AI, if at all, in addressing some of these inequalities. And so related to this, I think one of the threads that I'm most excited to explore is understanding how to reflect the complex intersection between social determinants of health and other demographic and clinical variables in AI models, because I just feel like that's something that we really need to get right.
Thank you. Sorry, you froze for a second there. Can I come back to you then? So tools and techniques that you're excited about to combat inexcusable techno-optimism.
Well, it's a difficult one, because to some extent that in itself is shows how hopeful we are that that technology can solve things, can help solve things.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I have seen very encouraging insights into in modeling, for instance. So AI in healthcare, not at the point where the doctor interacts with the patient, but before that, in the development of new medication, and a lot of recognition that tools should be developed in such a way that a human remains in the loop. And so the acknowledgement that for instance, people should not be replaced by AI tools, but should have AI tools in order to improve the quality of their work, I think is a promising way to go forward.
And Ashley, can I come to you next?
Yeah, I think, the question is, am I confident, I suppose, in some of these tools? And again, do I think what I can't say is I can't say, oh, I recommend to do this. What we've seen, certainly with my work, is that we've seen, say, more artificial intelligence come into, say, recruiting practices. But what I've been concerned about is the lack of ethical discussion around some of these things. For example, I've seen software which now effectively video interviews candidates and kind of automatically rates them on how they've been doing. Now, that's seen as great, yay, look, we can screen and see so many more people than having a person. But ultimately, who decides what good looks like? Do I look good? If I'm wearing a hat today, does that impact my performance? Does that affect the substance or the substance of what I'm actually saying and the quality of the work that I could do? And who are making those decisions? And these things are trained on effectively people saying, well, this is good, or our best people. And our best people is based on a system which we already know is inherently biased and discriminating, do this. So therefore, maybe other good people would also do this. And then you develop systems which are self-reinforcing. And so yes, technology might be great in terms of fantastic, we can see many more people. But if we've got all these problems in that technology, then is it actually fundamentally any better? Or is it actually absolving people of that responsibility and more dangerously putting it into this black box which people don't understand at all? And then whose responsibility is it, so to speak? Oh, let's just talk about the algorithm. We saw that with the education and the scandal, I suppose, that we saw in the GCSE and A-level results. This was all blamed on the algorithm. But who was coming up with this algorithm? And who's accountable for this algorithm? And all of these are massive questions. So, look, I think we've seen some things, but I haven't got, frankly, much faith because of the people behind the systems that any of this technology is fundamentally going to improve the outcomes for the world. And that's really worrying as we become more reliant on technology.
So technology to police technology, deep skepticism. I suspect that's probably fair. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. And Renee, may I come to you next, please, on tools and techniques?
Well, I'll say this. When it comes to tools and techniques, of course, they're designed by humans. So it comes back to the challenge of who's doing the designing. I think we've got to look at, for me, the greatest tool is thinking and how people think about technology. And what we have seen continuously when it comes to accountability and transparency and explainability when it comes to tech is the lack of inclusion, the lack of diversity, the further marginalization of already marginalized voices, certain voices that continue to be unrepresented, underrepresented, the need to amplify certain voices and certain communities. So while I do a lot of risk management work and looking at those tools, you always find there's some element of risk in it. And it goes back to who's doing the designing. So it's about raising consciousness and understanding things like systemic racism and how deeply ingrained in the psyche these issues are. And we've seen it. Some of the greatest designers of these regulations and frameworks are also some of the greatest perpetrators of unethical behavior, as we have seen in recent times when it comes to looking at risk and raising those questions. And we look at the treatment of some of our ethicists. So it really speaks to me about more of a consciousness and the thinking when it comes to understanding the long-term socio-technological or cultural and technological impacts of technology. And it also comes back to looking at the legacy of what this technology is going to create. So it's about much more of a critical thinking perspective when it comes to understanding systemic racism and these types of challenges. And it's also about bringing a particular kind of vigilance to the work that's being done. And if that doesn't work, we've got to get stronger on enforcement when it comes to companies who are in breach of what is supposed to be ethical behavior, because we are seeing a lot of harms being created, and then we see these harms are trying to be played off as though they've just been some sort of technological glitch. No, it's a conscious glitch of what's in your psyche.
So hearing you speak there, it occurs to me that this might be a place for certification and validation of algorithms. When you talk about this risk management approach, in Europe we have a new European framework that's going to come in for AI, and a big part of that is going to be identifying the most high risk algorithms, being able to classify and then attach appropriate, whether it's a pre-conformity assessment or whether it's some kind of validation and certification later on in the process. Obviously, there's issues with that. Who does the validation and certification? How do you protect IP? Are you going to be able to get enough explainability into the more sophisticated models to do that? But do you think that that sort of construct has legs? Do you think that would help with what you're describing?
It can help, but is it enough? The thing is it enough? And I don't think it is enough. Because we see, as I said, there's so many frameworks and regulations and all sorts of different ideas and concepts that we see. I mean, up until recently, we saw like major car companies releasing ethical frameworks about how autonomous vehicles should operate. But then again, when we see them again, it's because they are perpetrating the said thing they're speaking again. So it really comes back to a kind of honesty that we need to have these conversations, ask the tough questions, and don't be afraid of the answers. And we've been seeing a lot of that in the United States in particular when it comes to looking at AI ethics and the fact that, so much of the work that's being done and the early work that has been done by, let's say, women of color, let's say Black women like Joy Buolamwini and Timnit Gebru and Deborah Raj, looking at the question of facial recognition and unethical algorithms. And then what do we see? We see the continuous sort of neglect or, even discrimination against Black women who are ethicists in their workspace. So I think we've got to drill just a little deeper into the conversation.
And I completely agree with you, and I want to come back again, because when we do talk about the culture and governance piece, I want to talk a lot about what Ashley raised at the beginning, which was who is actually doing the designing, who is doing the monitoring, and who is listening to them, and who isn't. So thank you so much for that. Alan, I want to come to you finally on the question around tools and techniques. And then I just want to let our audience know, no promises, because we still have one question left, but if you do write a question in the chat, I will see if we can get to it. So Alan.
Yeah, first of all, I want to echo what Renee said, and Ashley, frankly, it's an interesting problem to solve, because to Renee's point, it starts with people, number one, and people are inherently biased. Number two, there's an use of AI discussion that needs to take place. And not only does it need to take place at the company level, right? Companies should not be creating AI unless they have a framework and a governance model. I know we're gonna get to that in just a second, around the creation of the AI. And that governance model means that you have to have people that are represented in the data set, or people that you expect that AI to engage, represented in that design process. You have to have differently abled people with neurodiversity, gender diversity, ethnic diversity. You have to have that a part of the conversation, or you will inherently create a biased outcome. But then we can't forget that there is a legislative component to this, right? We cannot trust that every company is going to be ethical and produce product. And the reason why you cannot trust is because whenever you start to integrate human rights, discrimination with capitalism, unfortunately, capitalism always wins. And so if it's a matter of, do you get the product out in time, or do you ensure that it does not have bias, or that it's not discriminatory? I'm concerned that those capitalistic systems may not prove, or may not err on the side of non-bias. So again, I just want to echo Renee and Ashley and everyone else on the call today. I absolutely agree. It's a big topic, and I actually think we need to slow down and tap the brakes on AI. Frankly, until we have an ethical conversation and some standards and controls in place to ensure that these systems are not doing more harm than good.
I can see panelists nodding to that. I think the point you raise around capitalism and the motivations that sit there is a whole nother summit, let alone a whole nother panel.
Exactly.
But again, I do think in the last couple of years, the conversation around responsible capitalism, purpose-led businesses has come on a long, long way. Our global CEO, Al Kelly, was one of the leaders that signed the Business Leaders Roundtable last year, which was quite an extraordinary restatement of the purpose of companies in the mind of those leaders. So as to really explicitly state that they no longer see themselves just as there to serve investors, but also to serve the communities in which they operate, the environment and the planet, their employees, consumers. And I do think that sort of psychology is reshaping the capitalist world. And I hope that COVID will accelerate that further. I hope that will be one of the benefits that comes out. But I hear you on that. Now, the final question, which everyone's been itching to get to, I know, and I'm going to start with Ashley because he got us there first at the beginning. But so governance and culture. So, I mean, this is absolutely huge. Unpack it any way that you like. But it does feel to me as though it's been made very clear by all of you that it's not enough to look to the technology to fix this. What else can we be doing in terms of companies, the governance of companies? Oh, Ashley?
Yeah, sorry,
Okay.
sorry. Yeah, governance and culture. I think, look, I suppose if I had the silver bullet, I'd gold plate it and sell it to everybody. I mean, that's the truth. Look, I think again, we've spoken a lot of this conversation about we need to kind of have some conversations, but I'm liking what I'm starting to see from the results of this conversation. So, for example, take the NASDAQ. Like, I think this week just passed that they announced that they were planning to basically enforce diversity reporting and board representation. I think that is the sort of moves that we need to see, because that drives a particular type of behavior change. It means that people become far more accountable and far more notable, and they have to have that uncomfortable conversation about, why do we still have no women? Why is everybody on our board still a white man? Like, we need to have those conversations and then ultimately build robust strategies and plans around it. And when it sits at the very top level of the tables, then it starts to do that. But we can't just leave it there. We can't just have people just tick the box and say, well, great, we found a woman to sit on our board and that's us done for the year. Like, we need to do more, and we need to drive more transparency in organizations at that level, but also down. What's happening on the leadership level, what's happening in middle management, and how do we have those conversations? And that needs to happen in a multitude of approaches, because there's people like me at Color in Tech which are banging the door. There's lots of people here who are obviously passionate and care about these issues as well. There are loads of employees that need to make that heard, and there are also loads of investors who need to make that heard as well. Because ultimately, if we go back to capitalism, I'm a firm believer that ultimately this translates into better business. Like, I firmly believe that if we have better decision making, we will make better decisions. Better decision making needs to encompass broad ideas. Like, that should not be a controversial concept. So how do we get to that? And if this doesn't need to be an either or. Like, great. So once we galvanize around that idea, then it's how do we drive these behaviors? And that, it's only uncomfortable if people don't accept things. Yeah, it becomes far easier to accept that the world needs to evolve and adapt like it always has done, rather than keep the status quo with things. And it only becomes uncomfortable when there is a tension behind those sorts of things. So in terms of governance structures, I like, as I said, what I'm seeing from the top, and we need to hold organizations to account. We've seen a wave of activity with relation to Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement, and all sorts of things in relation to diversity in tech more broadly. But we need to hold people to account to that, and we need to ask those questions every single time. We need, as a media, to be asking them, why has your diversity stats not changed? What are you doing about it? Why are these researchers speaking out and feeling that they don't have a place in your organization? All these sorts of questions need to continue to be asked, and we ultimately need to hold people to account until they become accountable to the broader society that they operate in. Because right now they're not.
Thank you. Kanta, you're nodding, so I'm going to come to you. I'm going to come to you next. What do you have to add?
Well, I am very skeptical about for-profit companies improving anything anytime soon without the legal frameworks that we've been coming back to in this conversation, without those being in place, because these are for-profit companies. So as long as they are legally obliged to make a profit and can be prosecuted if they do not make a profit, then what incentive is there to do anything that does not positively impact their bottom line? And that means that there is very little room for doing anything that is not directly lucrative. And we know that legal interventions have always been necessary in order to prevent capitalist systems from exploiting human beings in the worst possible ways, because it was the East India Company, you know, a stock market registered company running most of India when it was a British colony. And it was because slavery could lead to such massive profits that it was institutionalized until it was made illegal. And now it still operates in the margins in forms of prison labor, or again, within countries that don't have these strong legal frameworks. So without that being imposed from the outside, to be honest, I am not surprised to see that, for instance, ethicists based inside for-profit companies are not able to influence much.
I mean, it's interesting what you say, isn't it? Because every for-profit company's nightmare is to have a product out there in the market that it then has to withdraw because that product has failed or has been exposed as being an unethical product. So in a lot of ways, you're talking about the longer term view, aren't you? That actually the sensible for-profit thing to do is to take the responsible approach, because actually you're going to end up, I mean, it's a little bit to Ashley's point, you're going to end up delivering better products and therefore better returns for your shareholders if you do things properly.
Well, I would hope so, but then Facebook was exposed to be massively unethical and it hasn't been pulled off the market.
We have 5 minutes left, so we're not going down that rabbit hole, but we could.
Well, this is why we need to hold people to account. This is why we need to call it out.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Spot on content.
Alan, take us home. We've got 5 minutes.
Look, I couldn't agree more with everyone. I mean, when you think, at the end of the day, AI cannot replace human judgment, in my humble opinion. And companies have to be held accountable for the decisions they make, given the communities that they serve. And so, again, I don't know if we're going to say anything that hasn't already been said today, but it is absolutely prudent that we do not create products that discriminate against individual rights. And Ashley, you said something in the beginning that I've really been thinking about, which is, who's the arbiter of what good looks like, right? Who makes that decision? And I'm concerned, to your point, Constance, that in the margins, right, something might be good enough by that company's standards, but it actually might be infringing or discriminating on 3% of the population. Well, to that 3% of the population, that's a problem, right? They're disenfranchised. And so now we're making a decision for the majority and suppressing the will of the minority. So it's a really tough conversation, and that's why we're having it today. But it's one that again, I think we should tap the brakes. I think we need these frameworks in place. And I agree. I think for-profit companies, we have to be very vigilant in making sure that we're regulating them around how they're creating products that are making decisions that impact human rights.
I'm going to send you out the potential regulatory framework coming here next year in Europe for AI, which Visa is very supportive of, and get everybody's views on that from the other side of the pond, because that would be fascinating, actually. Renee and Burmi, we have a couple of minutes left. Renee, let me come to you penultimately.
Certainly. I think we've got to appreciate that AI isn't really going anywhere, more and more because of COVID-19 and the fact that we need these contactless experiences. We are going to see more AI in just about everything we do. It's powerful, it's very pervasive, and it has some potential. We've got to be critical in the ways in which we are going to use this technology. For me, it comes back to advocacy and activism and evangelism when it comes to data and people understanding the power of that data. And it comes back to your rights. I think because we have so much fun with technology and we use it for so many things that entertain, we don't look at risks such as privacy and security and how these things could impact your life, or how being a part of a geofencing warrant could impact your future, or being mistaken by facial recognition could impact you. So it comes back to rights. And as we have had every movement in this existence has some sort of rights movement attached to it. So there's human rights, there's civil rights, gay rights, disability rights. And we've got to look at rights when it comes to data. And data is a right, and it really calls for not just the governments coming up with the frameworks or the regulations or the laws, because we know those things are in place in just about every sector, and there continues to be individuals and groups and organizations who are in breach of those things. Big tech is way ahead of tech law, and that big space in there, that loophole, is where they keep dancing around us. So it comes to really building the knowledge level, building public education and public awareness, getting communities involved in the conversation. And if it means to introducing topics such as AI and digital and data ethics at preschool or Montessori or kindergarten, that's what we've got to do to build the requisite levels of ethical resilience that's going to be needed as we move more and more into the future with this technology. So it's about rights.
Data rights, the data rights movement. That's it, 2021. And Burmi, finally.
Yeah, so I think in terms of governance and culture, I feel quite fortunate in a lot of ways to be working for the NHS. I think there's been a wider commitment to cultural change within the organization, particularly this year in light of BLM. And even though the NHS is a large institution, it's ultimately a public body that is committed to improving patient outcomes rather than its own bottom line. So it might be easier to get the necessary senior buy-in than you would, for example, at an organization that's primarily motivated by profit or the successful monetization of its products. And I think when we think about how those types of organizations actually fulfill their commitments to ethics, I think that we need to start thinking about more independence between who's at the top and those sorts of departments that they are supporting. So I think, for example, the idea should be to actually genuinely support those ethicists or that team rather than trying to control the message. And so I think going forward, that's just something that I hope changes in terms of processes so that people can actually do this work and try to implement change within the organizations that they're part of.
It's interesting you make that point. We are at time. I'm going to give a shout out to the current health secretary who was at DCMS at the point where they released a data ethics framework for government back in, I want to say 2016, which was one of the first sort of fully fleshed out frameworks that I saw for government to use. And it's still, they've refreshed it now, but I think you're right. There's definitely, it's fantastic if the public sector can lead in this, and private companies do notice and they do follow. I want to say thank you to this. This has just been a fantastic panel. It is a very dark, cold, rainy UK Wednesday afternoon here, and you have all just injected so much energy and passion and commitment and expertise. I know. Thank you. Thank you so much.